All right, hello everybody. We are once again expecting widespread severe weather today, spanning from the southwest all the way to the southeast, and we are expecting that it will pose all threats. So that means tornadoes, hail, and high wind. The date is May 29th, 2025, and let's dive right into the forecast. Today, the Storm Prediction Center has highlighted two separate slight risk areas, one in central Texas and one in the far southeast. Our central Texas risk is associated with a cold front and a disturbance draped across the Texas-New Mexico border. And then our southeastern risk is associated with lifting in front of a mesoscale convective system. Today, we have a quadruple tornado threat. We have one in our southeast risk area. We have one along the Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky border associated with a low pressure system. Our Gulf Coast tornado risk is associated with that mesoscale convective system. And then our central Texas to northwestern Texas risk area is associated with that disturbance and cold front, like I said earlier. And then we have two wind threats, one in our southeastern risk area associated with that mesoscale convective system, and then one in central Texas associated with that disturbance and cold front. Now, we only have one 50% hail risk in our central Texas risk area. Under a day two risk, this looks like it will be the quote unquote big day out of our past week of severe weather. Currently, it is posing only a 2% tornado risk, a 15% wind risk, pretty widespread, extending from Virginia all the way to the Georgia-Florida border. And then we have a 15% hail risk, which is in the same area as our wind. Day three, we have a small marginal up in the Chesapeake region. And this kind of signifies the small break that we're expected to get until June. And then, of course, we have a marginal in our hill country area of Texas, so far southwestern Texas. Looking at our European model for long-range guidance, what we can see is our storms from yesterday pushing eastward. We can see our mesoscale convective system also pushing eastward today. That's expected to bring threats and the tornado risk for this area, which is probably already over by time I post this. And then as we move on through the day, we can see that we get our storms in central Texas along this trough that's expected to deepen as we go into the day. And then as we push forward into Friday, we can see along that trough, we get our storms. And then as we move forward into Friday, we can see some lifting up in front of our trough. This is expected to be our main risk area for that day. And then as that line pushes through, it's only expected to add to that risk. After today, we're expected to get a 3-day break from our severe weather with only small disturbances here and there causing chance for concern. Our first taste of severe weather in June is expected to be associated with a tropical system, actually, right here along the New Mexico-Texas border. And then what we can see in the upper plains, we can actually see our strong trough that we're expecting in early June causing more severe weather. One thing I would like to point out is the predicted June 3rd looks like it could be possibly the biggest day of this event. This is an evolving situation, so we'll just have to see what happens. As we move further, our trough pushes east across the U.S., bringing severe weather with it to our eastern coast. Here's our visual satellite from today. What we do see, we can see our mesoscale convective system pushing east in our southeastern region of the United States. And then what we can really notice is our trough and our jet streaking across the US. If I press play, we can see how quick that air is moving. And then we can see some convection associated with that bubbling up on the Texas-Oklahoma border. And what I would like to point out is in front of our low out here, we do have some clearing. So this will allow the air mass to destabilize as we go into today. As you can see, on our main risk area today, we have some clouds, but those aren't expected to be detrimental to the environment today. And then one last thing, we can actually see our cold front pushing southward, and this will kind of act as a train track for storms today. Here's our simulated reflectivity from our HRRR. What we do notice is that low pressure spinning up here, and that's going to be cause for our storms in this region later. So our Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky area. As we move forward, we'll see storms fire up associated with that. Here we go at around 0Z, so mid-afternoon to late afternoon. And then what we really notice is along our disturbance back here in Texas, we see a little line of thunderstorms sort of fire off, and then along our cold front up here. This is why this is the most potent area that we're expecting today. And as we can see, the HRRR is predicting that storms will be rotating around this area in the mid to late afternoon, extending into the night hours. And then actually it's expected to turn into a line of storms, which will really, that's when the wind threat is expected to ramp up. Taking a look at our southeastern sector, we can see our mesoscale convective system pushing eastward and then some rotating storms south. But by the time I post this video, the tornado threat for this area will probably be finished. And then we do see some lifting in the Carolinas up in front of our mesoscale convective system. These could pose a threat for wind, small hail, and potentially a tornado. And then down here in Florida, we see some lifting in front of our system. This is the act of our sea breeze and sort of our inland and ocean air masses clashing, and that will cause some storms with the threat of mostly wind and very small hail. Let's take a look at our Cape. So our storm fuel around when storms are expected to fire around mid-afternoon in Texas. We see that we get a maximized area of around 4,000 Cape, but mostly around it is 2,500 to 3,000 joules per kilogram. So that's still plenty for storms to initiate and be fueled. We can see our shear vectors from our initiating boundaries, pretty perpendicular to our disturbance over here, but almost parallel to our cold front. So that's why we're going to see storms sort of congeal into that line somewhat quickly. Looking at our southeastern sector, we can see that in our tornado risk areas today, this is where our Cape is maximized, so 3,000 around the Gulf Coast, and then some pockets of 3,000, but mostly 1,000 to 2,500 up here along our Atlantic coast risk area. Then up here in our Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky risk area, we actually see Cape maximize around 1,000 to 2,500. So that will be definitely enough for storms to fire and be fueled. Looking at our dew point from our HRRR, we notice our two air masses clashing back here along with our disturbance, and that's going to cause the lift for these storms to initiate. And then as we go deeper into the risk area, that's when we start to see those higher dew points around 65 to some pockets of 70. That's going to help these storms live for longer and produce hazards for longer. As we look into the southeast, it's no surprise that our dew points are in the 70s to lower 60s. This is going to allow that mesoscale convective system to exist for a longer time and pose that wind and hail along with a very small tornado threat for a longer time as well. One interesting thing that I'd like to point out on our temperature model for our Texas risk area, we can actually see that heating boundary and our cold front very clearly. So this is where our storms are going to track, and this is where our storms are going to initiate back here. Lastly, we're going to take a look at some soundings in order from what I think is the most potent sounding to the least. This is our southwestern to central Texas risk area. And what we noticed, our low level shear, there is some curve and there is some shear in the low levels, but mostly it's pretty straight. This is why we're not seeing as high of a tornado threat and more of a hail and wind threat. What we do notice is that our temperature dew point spread is somewhat larger than what we would like to see for tornadoes. So this means that storms could have some issues getting surface based. Our lapse rates are pretty good with the temperature decreasing 8.1 Celsius per kilometer. We do have some dry air aloft, which could be an issue with the degree of force seen today. But we do have some wind veering, and then we do have probably enough shear and then enough helicity, as long with enough deep level shear to maintain these storms and be cause for the risk of a small tornado threat. One last thing I want to look at down here, there is basically no capping in this environment, so these storms will be able to grow as they please. And then our cape, we have over 3,000, so that's plenty for storms. Then our precipitable water, 1.24 inches, not super low, not super high, so that shouldn't pose an issue with downdrafts, super large hail, and messy storms. Here's our Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky risk area. Once again, we do see pretty straight level photographs with some shear in the lower levels. So that is why the tornado threat for these is not very large. We do see very little helicity, some shear in the lower levels, and then we do see some deep level shear that is probably enough to sustain storms for some time, but not a super long time. We see our dew point temperature spread is pretty small. We do see some dry air aloft, but there's probably enough forcing out there today to have that not really be an issue. We do have enough cape for this region, around 2,400 to over 1,000, but we do see a very large precipitable water. So what that means is that these storms have a high possibility of struggling with tornadoes and producing larger downdrafts. For our last sounding, we're looking at our Atlantic risk area. What we can see is that it is extremely saturated all the way up. So that does mean that the air is more stable out there. We have a pretty funky photograph with some wind in the lower levels, but very weak upper level shear. This will not be enough to sustain organized storms. If they do fire down here, we can see that it is not enough. We are looking for over 30 to 40. But however, we do see some low level shear. We do see very low levels of spin. However, we do have over 1,000 joules per kilogram out here. But we do have an extremely high precipitable water content. So these storms will likely be downdraft overpowering, messy wet storms. And then one last thing, our lapse rates are not ideal. Only 5.9 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. And yeah, that's it for this weather sounding. On to our last bit. This is our excessive rainfall outlook. So nothing extreme out here today. Here's our 6 to 10 day temperature outlook, which is valid from June 3rd to the 7th. We are seeing that continued prediction of above average temperatures up in the Great Lakes region, Florida, and our Gulf states, along with that lower than average out west, which is going to be associated with our ridging and our trough back here. Lastly, this is our 6 to 10 day precipitation outlook, which is also valid from June 3rd through the 7th. We are expecting below average precipitation in the Northeast through these states, above average in Florida, and mostly above for the rest of the US, except in the Southwest, which is kind of a bummer because these states are currently in a pretty large drought.